Quadratic equations is what we're studying today. The goal, to solve quadratic equations by taking roots and completing the square. So what do I mean by quadratic equations? So a quadratic equation would be the kind we're looking at, can be written in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. It may not be in that form initially, but it can be written in that form. In other words, you can set it equal to 0. And this is where a, b, and c are just constants, constant real numbers. So that's our goal. Now this is an equation with one variable in it. Our goal is to solve it. Let's first look at an example where we're solving by taking roots. So in part A, we have x squared equals 16. You guys know how to solve this. What do you do to both sides to get x? So we have x squared equals 16. What do you do to both sides? Take the square root. Now, there's an additional step here. When we took the square root of both sides to get... Now, by the way, why are we doing this? Why are we taking the square root? Well, it turns out that the square root of x squared, if you don't know whether or not x is positive or negative, it turns out that that's actually equal to the absolute value of x, isn't it? And we do that because x could be negative. Oh, so we want to find all the solutions, all of the roots. So the square root of 16 is 4, as you know. But what's another possibility? To solve the original equation, x squared equals 16, what's another possible value of x? Negative 4. So when we were using the idea of taking the square root of both sides when solving equations we got from the Pythagorean theorem, we were talking about triangles, right? So did we worry about the negative answer there? No, we were talking about the lengths of the sides of triangles. You're not going to have a negative length of a side of a triangle. But I mentioned before that later on, when we wanted to get all the solutions, we were going to have to slap on a plus or minus on the radical in front of, in this case, the 16. So that means the two possible answers are plus 4 and minus 4, long story short. Which really means x could be two things. X could be negative 4 or x could be positive 4. Now, can you check your answers? You can always check your answers. Just plug it into the original equation. Does 4 squared equal 16? You betcha. Does negative 4 quantity squared equal 16? Yeah, it does. Now remember, when you square a negative 4, when you plug negative 4 in, you need parentheses around it. So if you're showing how to check your answer with the negative 4, make sure you put parentheses around the negative 4 and square it. Because if you just write the opposite of 4 squared, if you don't put parentheses around the thing you plug in, then that really means negative 16, which of course, that's not what we meant to say, right? Okay. All right, enough with that. You guys all understood that one. Let's do a slightly more difficult one. Same directions. We're going to solve for x by taking roots. So if you think about the last problem, we had x squared by itself on one side in the last problem, didn't we? And we need to get that again before we can take roots. So what should we do? When necessary, what should we do? What should we isolate? Isolate the x squared. And that's easy enough to do. What could you do to both sides in x squared plus 8 equals 0 to accomplish that? Just subtract 8, right? So solving for x squared, subtract 8 from both sides, we get x squared equals negative 8. And then what's going to happen? What do we do next? If we want to get, we have x squared on the left side. If we want to get x, what do? Take the square root of both sides. When we take the square root on the right side in front of the constant, negative 8, what do I need in front of that square root? Plus or minus. So that on the left side, the square root of x squared, we'll just think of that as x. What's the square root of negative 8? What is that going to involve? Yeah, let's poke the I out. The square root of negative 8 is equal to I radical 8, right? So plus or minus square root of negative 8 is plus or minus I times root 8. And then remember, you simplify the square root of 8 as usual. So how does the square root of 8 simplify? Just maybe scratch work over here. What's the biggest perfect square that's a factor of 8? 4. Yeah, 4 times 2. The square root splits up over multiplication, so what can you pull out? The square root of 4 is 2. So you could write this as x equals plus or minus I times this guy is really 2 root 2. Most people, for whatever reason, switch the multiplication around. I times 2 is the same as 2i. So most people write plus or minus 2i times radical 2. But really, either way is correct. So there you go. Any questions so far? Okay. So solving by taking roots works really well when there's just a single term being squared involving the unknown and then a constant in the equation, right? If there's in other words, if there's like an x to the first power, this method wouldn't work so well because when you isolate the x squared, you'd have on the other side something involving x. But when there's just an x squared in it, like the first two examples, it works great.